Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
The Prime Minister's former chief advisor, Dominic Cummings, has launched a blistering attack on Boris Johnson after reports that he had played a part in leaking text messages between the Prime Minister and the businessman Sir James Dyson. Our deputy political editor, Vicky Young, is in Westminster, and Dominic Cummings strongly denies leaking any messages, and he has a lot more to say than just that.
He certainly does, and let's start with why this outburst now. Well, the front pages of some newspapers today had an anonymous Downing Street source blaming Mr Cummings for some recent leaks. Well, now Mr Cummings is having his say. Firstly, he denies leaking the text messages between Boris Johnson and the businessman Sir James Dyson, reported by the BBC earlier this week. And he says he's happy to hand his phone over to a senior civil servant to prove that he didn't have access to them. Now let's go back to November. There was a leak of the decision to put England into a second lockdown. Again, Mr Cummings denies that that was him. He says the Prime Minister knows that it wasn't him, and he accuses the Prime Minister of wanting to stop the inquiry into that leak because it would cause him personal difficulties. And then there's the issue of the renovation of the flat at number 11 Downing Street, where the Prime Minister lives with his fiancée Carrie Simons. For months there were rumours that this involved a very expensive designer, and there was a lot of speculation about who was going to pick up the bill. Well, Mr Cummings says today that he told the Prime Minister that plans to have Conservative donors secretly pay for the renovation were unethical, foolish, possibly illegal, and almost certainly broke the rules. Today the government said that the costs of the wider refurbishment in this year have been met by the Prime Minister personally.
And briefly, Vicky, how damaging is this for the Prime Minister?
I think this is a huge problem. Dominic Cummings was beside the Prime Minister for a very long time. He knows a lot of secrets, and he's clearly willing to put them into the public domain.
Vicky Young, thank you.
The bitter row between the Prime Minister and his former key advisor, Dominic Cummings, has erupted into an extraordinary public spat tonight. Mr Cummings accused Boris Johnson of trying to stop a leak inquiry because it allegedly affected one of the Prime Minister's allies. He also openly questioned the competence of Mr Johnson. It came after speculation that Mr Cummings was the source of leaked text messages between the Prime Minister and Sir James Dyson. Well, I'm joined now by our political editor, Robert Peston. So, Robert, what exactly is Mr Cummings alleging here?
So the first thing to say, this is a full-scale political crisis for the Prime Minister because Dominic Cummings was, for the first period of his premiership, the most powerful official who knew more than anybody else how the Prime Minister governed. Now, he's reacted furiously to briefings, he says, by Jack Doyle, the Director of Communications at Downing Street, that went to the newspapers last night, alleging that he, Mr Cummings, was the source of a series of leaks, including the one you've referred to, which is of text messages, which seemed to show that the Prime Minister had too chummy a relationship with a very senior businessman who was saying he was going to help with ventilators. But the other claims that Cummings makes, again, angrily reacting to suggestions from Downing Street that he was responsible for leaks in these areas. So he, as you may remember, that back in November there was a leak of the lockdown that was coming. There was a search, an official search for the so-called Chatty Rat. He says Downing Street have accused him of being the Chatty Rat. He says he can prove that it wasn't him, that it was an official called Henry Newman. He says the Prime Minister refused to punish Henry Newman because Henry Newman is too close to his fiancée, Carrie Simons. And then I think the most devastating claims of all by Dominic Cummings, so far I may say, is relating to the fact that the Prime Minister, he says, was seeking to get help from party donors to redecorate his Downing Street flat, which Dominic Cummings says was wholly unethical, and he told the Prime Minister it was unethical. And
Robert, you say a full-scale political crisis, but just how serious is this for the Prime Minister?
Oh, I can't think of actually... Almost, I can hardly think of anything quite as serious as this for a Prime Minister. You know, somebody who has been so close to him, saying that he governs, as I say, in an unethical way, and more, I think, worryingly for the Prime Minister. The thing that Dominic Cummings, he hasn't spoken about today, is most concerned about is he thinks the Prime Minister made a series of mistaken decisions about how to deal with COVID. He believes those decisions by the Prime Minister cost lives, and he wants to talk about that on oath, which is the last thing the Prime Minister would want. So, yes, we are on the brink, I think, of weeks of damaging destabilisation of this Prime Minister.
All right, Robert, we'll be watching how this all unfolds. Thank you.
Now, the Prime Minister's former senior advisor, Dominic Cummings, has denied leaking text messages between his old boss and the businessman Sir James Dyson. A lengthy blog post followed a deluge of newspaper headlines in which Downing Street sources pointed the finger at him for leaking information about the lockdown, dubbing him the Chatty Rat. Mr Cummings not only denied the story, but savaged his former colleagues. Our correspondent Paul McNamara is in Downing Street. Paul.
Jackie, it is hard to stress just how incendiary this blog post is. This is a man who was loathed by many when he worked in this building. I'm guessing a few more dislike him right now. But before we get into what the former aide and friend to the Prime Minister, Dominic Cummings, wrote, let's start with the why. So earlier this week, texts between the Prime Minister and billionaire businessman James Dyson were leaked to the BBC, where it shows James Dyson asking for tax breaks in order to help with making ventilators last year. Overnight, Downing Street sources briefed a couple of newspapers that they suspected the leaker was Dominic Cummings. Cue blog post, where Mr Cummings emphatically denies leaking these messages, but then goes on to make some extraordinary claims against the Prime Minister. So first, a leak in October of a planned second lockdown. A leak that led many to rush to the pub, may have caused a surge in infections, and at the time fingers were pointed at Dominic Cummings as the so-called Chatty Rat leaker. Well, in his blog post, Mr Cummings says he wasn't the leaker, that a leak inquiry found that he wasn't the leaker, and that the actual leaker was most probably a friend of the Prime Minister's fiancée, Carrie Symonds. And this is where it gets really awkward for the Prime Minister, because Mr Cummings writes that Boris Johnson said to him, quote, perhaps we could get the Cabinet Secretary to stop the leak inquiry. I told him this was mad and totally unethical. Now, bear in mind, to this day, we still haven't seen the results of that leak inquiry.
Well, none of that is very good. Is there more?
Oh, yes. So, next allegation concerns a story about the Prime Minister allegedly trying to get his private flat refurbished and the cost picked up by the Conservative Party. On this, Dominic Cummings writes, I told him I thought his plans to have donors secretly pay for the renovation were unethical, foolish, possibly illegal. That's pretty bad. On this story, actually, the Cabinet Office released a statement today in which they said that the Prime Minister has picked up all the costs for the refurb himself. But then, after all those allegations, and there are more, Dominic Cummings finishes with a little flourish. He says, quote, it is sad to see the Prime Minister and his office fall so far below the standards of competence and integrity the country deserves. We've been trying to contact Downing Street since this blog post landed. They haven't got back to us. Now, look, it would be easy to say, well, look, this is an embittered former employee. Of course he's going to write things on a blog. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's true. However, Mr Cummings also says during this that he has texts, he has emails, he's happy for them to be public, and he's happy to answer questions from MPs for as long as they want to ask him questions on May 26th. This today has basically thrown rocket fuel onto a dumpster fire. May 26th, he could be lobbing a couple of grenades into it too.
Paul, thanks very much.
Dominic Cummings has come out all guns blazing tonight, attacking the Prime Minister by questioning his competence and integrity. It's a remarkable intervention from his former advisor, whom Boris Johnson failed to sack after his infamous trip from London to Barnard Castle during the first lockdown. The attack came after headlines this morning quoting a Number 10 source claiming that Boris Johnson believes Cummings was behind the leaking of texts between the Prime Minister and James Dyson over tax affairs. In fact, Dominic Cummings makes a series of extremely serious allegations for which he says he has proof. A subsequent statement from Number 10 asserts that at all times, government and ministers have acted in accordance with the appropriate codes of conduct and electoral law. The question is, will all this cast a pall over the Tory vote in the forthcoming elections, which are less than 2 weeks away? Here's our policy editor, Lewis Goodall, and his report does contain some flashing images.
It's been a week about hushed whispers about who said what to whom and when. It ends with a political conflict which is very, very noisy. A tale which may just be beginning. Last night, Downing Street briefed that the Prime Minister believed that Dominic Cummings was responsible for the leaks of his text messages with James Dyson, as well as for previous leaks, including over lockdowns last year.
Have you and other ministers broken the rules, Prime Minister?
If it was an attempt to move the story on from uncomfortable territory around Johnson's conversations with Dyson, then it has spectacularly backfired. In a sensational and unusually pithy blog post published this afternoon, Cummings makes a series of extremely serious allegations about the Prime Minister and his Number 10 operation. First of all, with regards to the leak, Cummings said that he wasn't responsible for leaking the Dyson PM text in question, but does say, "I do have some WhatsApp messages between the PM Dyson forwarded to me by the PM. I'm also happy to publish or give to the Cabinet Secretary the PM Dyson messages that I do have, which concern ventilators, bureaucracy and COVID policy, not tax issues." All the more interesting, given that the Prime Minister at PMQs indicated that his text with Dyson might be published in full, but they haven't been. But this wasn't the only area dissected by Cummings, far from it. The Number 10 story suggested that Cummings had leaked the news of a lockdown last year. Cummings said that that wasn't the case. The Cabinet Secretary told the PM that the leak was neither me nor the then Director of Communications, and that all the evidence definitely leads to Henry Newman and others in that office. The PM was very upset about this. He said to me afterwards, "If Newman is confirmed as the leaker, then I will have to fire him, and this will cause me very serious problems with Carrie, as they're best friends. Perhaps we could get the Cabinet Secretary to stop the leak inquiry?" I told him that this was mad and totally unethical, that he could not possibly cancel an inquiry about a leak that affected millions of people just because it might implicate his girlfriend's friends. Downing Street tonight said that the Prime Minister had never interfered with a leak inquiry, though that isn't quite the allegation that Cummings put. Henry Newman is a former special advisor to Michael Gove and now an advisor in Number 10 and is close to Boris Johnson's fiancée, Carrie Symonds. What is Cummings hoping to achieve by all of this?
I've no reason to think Cummings is after anything other than revenge on Boris Johnson and his entire apparatus. It's part of the long story of the power struggle. It's also, I suppose, an ethics story about what politicians and ministers should and shouldn't properly do. And it's a story about how government should and shouldn't work.
And there was yet more. Boris Johnson had wanted to raise money for the refurbishment of his Number 10 Downing Street flat via Tory party donors. He has since abandoned the scheme and paid for it himself. But Cummings says this: Number 10 made accusations regarding me and leaks concerning the PM's renovation of his flat. The PM stopped speaking to me about this matter in 2020. As I told him, I thought his plans to have donors secretly pay for the renovation were unethical, foolish, possibly illegal, and almost certainly broke the rules on proper disclosure of political donations if conducted in the way he intended. I refused to help him organise these payments. He concluded, "It is sad to see the PM and his office fall so far behind the standards of competence and integrity the country deserves." If you think this is all just a typical Westminster Number 10 political psychodrama, then consider this. It is hard to overstate the seriousness of these accusations, whatever you think of the accuser. Dominic Cummings was Boris Johnson's right hand, and yet here he is accusing the Prime Minister of lying, of behaving without integrity, of giving thought to override official processes in his own interest, of considering something that Dominic Cummings at least believed was potentially illegal, and Cummings hints there is more to come. It was only a year ago that the Prime Minister and Cabinet Ministers expended significant sums of political capital to keep Dominic Cummings in a job, and some believe significantly undermined their public health messaging into the bargain. And for what? Less than a year later, Dominic Cummings and Boris Johnson seem intent on destroying each other.
If you're going to go to war with Dominic Cummings, go very heavily armed, because he will fire back. And one of his favourite sayings, I think it was originally Bismarck's, comes to mind, which is, with a gentleman and a half, with a pirate and a half. In other words, what Dominic Cummings is saying is, you fire at me, I will fire back at you double, and Downing Street will know that.
All of this ahead of the biggest set of elections before the next general election in just a fortnight's time. Perhaps none of it will break out of the bubble, but we can't know what Cummings knows and what he might yet share. It represents a deeply volatile element in an otherwise seemingly benign political environment for Boris Johnson. There's little doubt in Westminster tonight. It's war.
Lewis Goodall. Well, we did ask the government to come on tonight's programme, but they declined. Number 10 did say in a statement that at all times the government and ministers have acted in accordance with the appropriate codes of conduct and electoral law. Cabinet Office officials have been engaged and informed throughout, and official advice has been followed. They added that the PM has never interfered in a government leak inquiry. Well, in a moment we'll talk to our political panel, but first I'm joined by Lord Kerslake, former head of the Home Civil Service. Good evening, Lord Kerslake.
Good evening.
What was your reaction to Dominic Cummings' allegations?
Well, look, I've been inside and outside government for a long time, and I thought I'd lost the capacity to be surprised. I was wrong. The level of toxicity and the disregard for the proper way of doing things is quite breathtaking, and I don't think would have happened with Theresa May or indeed any other Prime Minister. This is quite extraordinary behaviour. Of course, we've only got one side of it with Dominic Cummings. But if what he says is true, then I think it is very serious indeed and goes to the heart of the way Number 10 is working at the moment.
But you say it wouldn't have worked in Theresa May's government. You've operated at the highest levels of government. How does this compare, do you think, with other scandals?
Oh, I think it's bigger, actually, in many ways.
Is it bigger than expenses?
I think it is, actually, because it goes to the centre of government. Expenses was about a very poor behaviour by MPs and some peers. That's what it was about. This is about the way the whole government works. Does it act with integrity, honesty, and propriety? These are crucial things. And trust in government, even if you don't agree with what it does, is a precious commodity. It's absolutely at the foundation stone of good government. And if people start to believe that government doesn't act in the interest of the country, it acts in the interests of certain individuals, then I think that's a very, very serious road to go down. Of
course, Number 10 denies all impropriety, but where do you think the biggest problems could lie for Boris Johnson?
Well, as your reporter said, there could be more to come. I think that's one big issue. I think the second thing is, though, what we see in the polls, and there's some evidence of this in a Daily Mail poll today, that people may not understand the detail of these individual incidents, but they certainly get the overall message. And they can understand a situation where a former Prime Minister looks to really run a campaign of influencing government policy where he stands to gain financially. They see big issues inside Number 10 as well. And I think it all adds up to a sense of something's not quite right here. And I think that will, in the end, do damage. There's time for him to address it, but he needs to fast.
But what about the allegation the Prime Minister was trying to shut down a leak inquiry that he set up? That surely is a pretty serious allegation. Of course, they have said they have never interfered in a COVID inquiry. But, you know, what Dominic Cummings is saying, he has proof. We don't know if he's bluffing or not. We don't know what that is. But if that allegation is proved to be true, how serious could that be for Boris Johnson?
I think very serious. Of course, it will be very hard to prove either way. But I do have to say it comes to something when Dominic Cummings is the person who's concerned about propriety and ethics. That's a normal role that he has played in government. And so I have to say it rings true. We have to test it. If it proved to be true, I think it would be quite a serious issue.
Do you think there is something inherently problematic about the relationship in government now between ministers and special advisors?
I think there are some issues in the way it's operating at the moment in this government. I actually believe special advisors can be an enormously valuable asset to both civil servants and ministers when it works well. But it does require the right balance of power and a proper understanding of roles. And I think there's some evidence that that's not happening at the moment. A bit of a fraud really is going on here.
Do you think then it depends on the style of Prime Minister? You know, for example, you know, the fish rots from the head. Do you think the tone and the atmosphere is set by the Prime Minister?
no doubt the Prime Minister sets the tone. I think Theresa May, people may have challenged her on particular policies and her approach, but she was punctilious, and I think everybody believed that. And she set the tone, really, and took tough decisions when things went wrong, if you like, or people behaved badly. She took action. I think they see a very different approach from this Prime Minister, and they take their cue from that accordingly.
Thank you very much for joining us. Well, the Cummings attack comes after a wave of sleaze allegations surrounding the former Prime Minister David Cameron, who, when working for the now defunct Greensill Capital, sent texts to Chancellor Rishi Sunak touting for business, and the revelation that the Health Secretary Matt Hancock had shares in a company awarded NHS contracts. So what is the cumulative effect of all this? Joining me now is Katie Balls, Deputy Political Editor of The Spectator, Polly Toynbee, columnist for The Guardian, and Tim Montgomery, former advisor to Boris Johnson. Good evening to you all. Katie Balls, first of all, do you think that Dominic Cummings has got more to come?
Yes, I mean, we know he has the select committee appearance next month where he said he's more than happy to dedicate as much time as is wanted by MPs. That's a change of tune to previous select committee appearances from Dominic Cummings. So I think we know that's going to be a blockbuster moment. But there also is a sense that I think we would not have had today's blog published had Downing Street not issued the briefings last night. But it's clear that Dominic Cummings does want to have a say on things. And I think we might get more even than just that one select committee appearance in terms of future interventions.
Tell me, what do you think the tone of all of this is? Is this about a man wronged who was once protected? Or is this about Boris Johnson, as we know, apparently dissing the whole idea of the vote leave contingent now? You know, he has no time for them, apparently. He'll be critical and so forth. Is there a feeling that people are literally being shut out? They're being wiped off?
Yeah, I think if we're looking at, I suppose, the intention here, I think that we've seen vote leave cast out of Downing Street effectively since late last year, when Dominic Cummings and Lee Kane left. And I think that has, although they're out of the building, it's almost as though the ghost of Dominic Cummings is large. And I think that has created issues because there's a lot of unfinished business. And ultimately, I think there's lots of ill will between the various factions. Some of him in Downing Street, some are not. But yet it still feels we're in this almost repeat civil war that breaks out every few months and not that much changes, even if it's a slightly different setting each time. It's still the core issues, really. Polly
Toynbee, I mean, the government has had a great vaccine rollout. You know, and what Boris Johnson says is that I don't think people give a monkeys about this. Is he right?
Well, I think it's certainly true that this comes at a time when Boris Johnson has been riding very high. I mean, the vaccine matters more to people than anything else. It's freedom, it's the end of lockdown. All of that has given him a huge bounce and is likely to be a bounce that takes him through these May elections too. But nevertheless, the flavour of this, I mean, it stinks. And Labour people on the doorstep are now saying they're getting it. They're hearing people talking about it. They may not know the details. But the moment Dominic Cummings' name comes into it, he is probably one of the most unpopular people in this country. They've never forgiven him for the Barnard Castle hypocrisy. And if he's coming up with all of this poison, the combination is pretty toxic. And also, it's very specific that the idea that he's attacking Boris Johnson for soliciting funds for doing up his flat, that's the kind of thing that's very graphic and people, it really has an effect. But there's lots more to come. There are all the PPE contracts, which the civil service said so many came from special contacts from Tory MPs that they couldn't even handle them. So there's a lot more to come.
Tim Montgomery, I mean, broadly, first of all, you might have heard Sir Bob Kersley, or not, but what he did say was that this is a capacity to be bigger than the expenses scandal. What do you make of that?
I think it's far too early to say that. And despite what Polly has just said, I think Dominic Cummings is not, as she implied, Mother Teresa in the eyes of the electorate. And so this is not sort of a critic of the Prime Minister who will immediately cause Downing Street to quake at. He doesn't have much of a reputation with the public. And so I think what matters about these allegations is not yet that they've been made, I don't think that will give them legs. What matters is what he sort of threatens within these within the blog that he issued today, is how much proof he has of some of the allegations that he makes. And I think the thing that Downing Street should worry about is really about this refurbishment of the number 10 flat. If it looks like there has somehow been a failure to properly declare the tax implications, in particular, of that renovation, the HMRC get involved, then it becomes a problem for Downing Street. I think up to the moment, the idea that politicians often hate each other and brief against each other isn't going to surprise many voters in the land at all.
But of course, what Boris Johnson has said, that he's actually absolutely paying for the whole refurbishment of the flat. But the nature of the allegation, I mean, you know, obviously this is an internecine fight, Tim, but the nature of the allegations, some of which are very serious, which, of course, and you talk about the flat being one of them, but the other one, what we were talking about, was the idea that he stopped a leak inquiry that he had ordered because it was going to be problematic. I mean, does that beggar belief? I mean, do you believe? It is obviously only an allegation. We don't have proof. Is it something that you could believe?
It is something I could believe, but I could also imagine the context in which Boris Johnson said it, you know, the sort of the chaotic way that he sometimes talks. He could have sort of made it as a sort of an aside rather than necessarily a strategy. I don't think that is the thing that they should worry about. I think it is what you first talked about, Kirsty. It's been the rumour in Westminster and Whitehall for a long time is there is this view that there is a big difference between the Prime Minister's outgoings, his expenditures, and the Prime Ministerial salary. And people wonder how those two things are bridged. Now, the refurbishment of Downing Street is the first time we've had a concrete example whereby that gap between the income he gets from all of us as taxpayers and potentially the outgoings that he has sort of reached into a form that we can speculate about. I think it's the possible journalistic continued inquiry into that gap and how it's made up could be the thing that rumbles on over the next few weeks and months and really starts to dog the Boris Johnson premiership.
And we have had another development tonight in the Telegraph are reporting that Eddie Lister, previously Chief of Staff to Boris Johnson, has resigned. Katie Bowles, what more do we know about the Eddie Lister story?
Yes, he's stepping down from an envoy role that he was recently given. It's quite a short time in the role. Now, the official reason is the fact that Boris Johnson is not going on his India trip anymore, given COVID, and that's the work he was doing. Eddie Lister has also been in the news due to various lobbying allegations in terms of links he has with firms. But I think overall it was the sense that he would be departing his role in government. But this is one of Boris Johnson's long-standing aides. So I think it's just another sign that when we're trying to work out who's doing what number 10, there's a lot of shifting sands right now, and it's not quite clear who the power brokers are. It's also a sign of how the lobbying scandal is affecting things.
Polly Toynbee, of course, this doesn't just taint the Tories. It affects the whole political elite. I mean, after all, we're talking about the expenses scandal. You know, that affected politicians across the board.
Indeed, because it involves peace right across the board. But this is very specifically about this government, about the chaotic conduct or misconduct inside number 10. And the sense that there is the Prime Minister with his private phone and any chum anywhere can call him up, get a contract, get his ear, the sort of thing that Cameron was doing. There are now so many different strands of sleazy things going on that even if people are a bit vague about exactly what is Green Cell, exactly why did Cameron stand to make millions and millions of pounds out of this lobbying, out of begging the Treasury, begging the Bank of England, the indignity of it, the sense that there is no wall any longer between the commercial world and lobbying of ministers. That's something that's very much to do with this government.
Tim Montgomery, just let's talk a minute about the cumulative effect. You know, we've had the PPE scandals, we had the affair with Jennifer Coury, which was more personal, we've had Greensill, we've had the Priti Patel bullying. It paints a picture of a government that's not quite on the front foot, that's not really on top of its game?
I'm not sure whether that's quite fair. And I think the overall position of this government at the moment in the opinion polls, because of the world-beating rollout of the vaccine, is a strong one and a deservedly strong one. I think, a few weeks ago, Kirsty, you know better about this than most people. There were the allegations, bombshell, always the word that people use, allegations from Alex Salmond against Nicola Sturgeon. And she rode them out, partly, I think, because unfortunately, the public do have a low expectation of the ethical behaviour of politicians. What could turn public opinion is if there is evidence, particularly of taxpayers' money being misused. The expenses outrage episode taught us that, but we haven't got there yet. So yes, this is a story that I'm sure is going to rumble on and could yet cause problems for the government. But unless you have that kind of specific, tangible, understandable abuse, I don't think the panic alarm stations will be ringing in Downing Street quite yet.
But there isn't a head honcho looking at ministerial standards just now, because Sir Alex Allen resigned, Katie Balls, over the Priti Patel bullying issue. We were told we were going to get an independent advisor ministerial standards appointed. There's still no name.
Yes, and I think there's some exasperation in terms of, even when we're talking about the ministerial code and, judging behaviours, that actually not all of this is having the impact or that it should do. I think there are a few things to look for, because in terms of inquiries and holding Boris Johnson and his government to standards, we have the various Greens inquiries. But I also think in terms of the allegations from Dominic Cummings, we know the Charities Commission is looking into various things. I think there are lots of difficult questions for Number 10 to answer. There's not an easy Friday night in there, and I think they are going to having various things coming up the track, which could make life very difficult for Boris Johnson. And it might not be an immediate backlash. We know the Tories are doing very well in the polls, but ultimately the psychodrama, I think, is damaging to all sides, even if it's one person such as Dominic Cummings bearing the main brunt.
I mean, Dominic Cummings' ammunition is toxic. It will be massive. It goes right back to the Leave campaign. How they could have decided to poke this particular snake, I cannot think. I mean, they're jolly lucky that he's kept quiet until now after they fired him. It was a dangerous thing to do. This is the man who knows where all the skeletons are.
Well, Tim Montgomery, I mean, you once were the advisor to Boris Johnson. I'm sure you don't necessarily want to give him any free advice tonight, but if you were going to be so generous as to give him free advice, what would you be saying to him to do?
I think it would be addressing some of the issues that you've raised. He's got to look like he gets ahead of this issue. He can't afford not to be appointing, a ministerial advisor on ethics. And also, I think he just needs to be a little bit more collegiate as well. He needs to, he certainly needs to get rid of his personal mobile phone. I've got a history of, I campaigned for a museum of communist terror with the Prime Minister, and I've got all sorts of messages from the Prime Minister assuring me that this was going to happen. Well, we all know that there isn't a museum of communist terror in the UK, or even plans for it. He cannot continue to operate government in a way where he's dealing outside of civil service, formal structures, liaising with people. He's got to have that organisation around him, which has slowly been built since Dominic Cummings left. Downing Street is a more organised place, but it's nowhere near as organised as it should be. And really allowing the grown-ups to fully organise him properly, that's what he's got to allow to happen, and to have some more accomplished cabinet ministers at senior levels in his administration, because at the moment it's too fly, it's too amateur, it's too disorganised.
Thank you all very much indeed.
The Prime Minister is being urged to explain how the refurbishment of his Downing Street flat was paid for, following allegations from his former chief advisor. Dominic Cummings has claimed that Boris Johnson had considered what he called possibly illegal plans to have Tory donors fund the work. Downing Street says Mr Johnson paid for the work himself and that nothing improper took place, but Labour has demanded an inquiry. This report from Ian Watson contains flashing images from the start.
Out, but not down. Boris Johnson's closest advisor left Downing Street in November, but now Dominic Cummings has not only denied that he leaked some of the Prime Minister's text messages, he's also opened a Pandora's box of accusations against his former boss. The most serious is that the funding of last year's renovation of the Downing Street flat, where the Prime Minister lives with his fiancée Carrie Symonds, wasn't above board, amid reports that costs were spiralling out of control. In a blog, Dominic Cummings says, "I thought his plans to have donors secretly pay for the renovation were unethical, foolish, possibly illegal." And this former Conservative law officer and long-standing critic of Boris Johnson has now entered the fray.
My impression is that there's been a constant wriggling about the source of the money for this refurbishment, and that's just one illustration of the chaos that Mr. Johnson seems to bring in his wake. And the reason for that is because he is a vacuum of integrity.
The government says the Prime Minister's paying for the works himself and that no codes of conduct or electoral law were broken. The Electoral Commission is looking into whether there were any undeclared donations. Number 10 says all donations that need to be reported have been. But Labour is accusing the government of not playing fair. They want to know if any Conservative donor was initially involved in the funding and are calling for more transparency and an inquiry.
Publish the details, have the full inquiry. If there's nothing to see here, whether it's the refurb of number 10, whether it's the dodgy contracts, whether the privileged access, if there's nothing to see, publish everything, have a full inquiry, because that, sunlight is the best disinfectant.
But a former advisor on standards in government thinks that more information rather than a new inquiry is what's needed.
We've probably got enough inquiries going on. It's actual concrete hard evidence which demonstrate where things have gone wrong that is critical now, and Cummings might just be able to provide some of that.
And Dominic Cummings has a means of communicating what he knows. Next month, he'll be able to give evidence publicly to a joint committee of MPs on the government's handling of the pandemic. The Prime Minister's former advisor clearly believes that the best form of defence is attack. He's now questioning Boris Johnson's competence and his integrity. And Dominic Cummings says he is happy to have every email that he sent and received during his time here at Number 10 published. Dominic Cummings is showing no signs of getting back in his box, and that could be bad news for his former boss. Ian Watson, BBC News.
Labour has demanded an inquiry into how Boris Johnson's Downing Street flat refurbishment was funded. It follows damning allegations from Dominic Cummings, who claimed his former boss once had possibly illegal plans to get Tory donors to pay for it. Sir Keir Starmer said that and other allegations of so-called sleaze stinks, adding if there's nothing to hide, all the details should be published. Downing Street say the Prime Minister has done nothing wrong. David Wood reports.
Who is making key decisions here, how some things are paid for and which businesses have influence are central to a series of damaging accusations swirling around Downing Street. Other than denials, no word from Number 10 today, nor from the home of the PM's former advisor who's made the latest criticisms. Dominic Cummings was ousted from Downing Street in November and had kept a lid on his revenge until now. He's questioned the PM's competence and integrity. That has angered some Tory MPs.
When I described Mr. Cummings as an unelected foul-mouthed oaf, I warned the Prime Minister to his face that if he didn't get rid of him, there was a chance that Mr. Cummings would bring him down.
And are these allegations serious enough, do you think, to bring the Prime Minister down?
There are allegations that will have to be investigated, certainly.
They include into texts between entrepreneur James Dyson, who was trying to build ventilators, and the Prime Minister about tax. But there are more questions. Dominic Cummings has claimed that the Prime Minister interfered with an inquiry in Downing Street into who leaked information about England's November lockdown before the PM was able to announce it. Mr. Cummings also claims that when looking to renovate the Downing Street flat, the Prime Minister had initially been looking at ways of funding it that Mr. Cummings claims were possibly illegal. And the Labour leader isn't happy just relishing his role as spectator in this saga. He's also sticking the boot in, calling for a full inquiry into the PM's flat makeover.
You've got the former most senior advisor to the Prime Minister saying he's fallen way below the standards of integrity that are needed for the office of Prime Minister. You've got the former Minister Dominic Grieve saying there's a vacuum of integrity, and every day there's more evidence of this sleaze, and frankly, it stinks.
Downing Street insists the PM's done nothing wrong, but Labour isn't planning to allow him the chance to kick the allegations away.
David, these claims are just not going away. How serious is this for the Prime Minister?
Certainly opposition parties will look to keep this as serious as possible for as long as possible. But I think in the short term, at least, it's not as serious as that because of the reaction from two important groups. One, Tory MPs, those who I've spoken to today, they're trying to keep out of it. They're happy that the PM paid for the renovations to the flat himself and for his other denials. The other key group, voters. Lots of elections going on at the moment. No sign today so far that this is cutting through with campaigning.
David, thank you.
The Prime Minister is under mounting pressure to reveal how the revamp of his Downing Street flat was funded, as opposition MPs demanded full disclosure. Mr Johnson's former chief advisor, Dominic Cummings, claimed yesterday he'd warned Mr Johnson that the idea of getting the renovations secretly funded by Tory donors would be unethical, foolish and possibly illegal. Number 10 is insisting that all the appropriate codes of conduct and electoral law have been followed. This report from political correspondent Liz Bates includes flash photography from the start.
It's been 5 months since he left, but Dominic Cummings is still making headlines and making enemies. Accused of leaking the Prime Minister's text messages, he hit back. In his latest blog released yesterday, he turns on his former boss, revealing details of private conversations and branding some of Boris Johnson's plans unethical, foolish, possibly illegal.
There are millions of people out there who want the government to get on the sort of the pandemic, want the government to fix the economy, want the government to fix issues of social inequality and so on. And what I think we're seeing is a soap opera of narcissists. There's chaos in there. It's not a government, it's chaos.
Now the battle of the briefings begins between Mr Cummings and Downing Street over who did leak details of the second COVID lockdown back in October. He says all evidence at the time pointed to Henry Newman, a Downing Street aide and a friend of the Prime Minister's fiancée, and that when Boris Johnson was told that, he tried to stop the leak inquiry, saying it would cause him serious problems with Carrie. Sources in government say it was Mr Cummings himself who was the so-called Chatty Rat, and reports today even claim that MI5 were brought in at the time to confirm it. According to Health Minister Nadine Dorries,
Downing Street know 100% who the Chatty Rat was, and those who protest it wasn't me doth protest way too much.
The other dispute is over the refurbishment of Downing Street, reportedly requested by Ms Simmons, who hired A-list interior designer Lulu Little. The project is said to have run into 6 figures. Mr Cummings claims that the Prime Minister told him of a plan to have Tory donors secretly pay for the renovation, but that he was against it and refused to help. In a statement, Downing Street said Mr Johnson has paid for the work himself. Labour are demanding an inquiry.
Whether it's the refurb of number 10, whether it's the dodgy contracts, whether the privileged access, if there's nothing to see, publish everything, have a full inquiry, because that, sunlight is the best disinfectant.
But the sleaze allegations just keep coming. The latest casualty, Eddie Lister, who is facing a mounting list.
Are you part of sleaze at the heart of government, Lord Lister?
Including claims he has shares in a company that has been awarded almost £1 million worth of government contracts. Late last night, he stood down from his senior role as Special Envoy for the Gulf. The Prime Minister thanked him for his service. Some have suggested the Prime Minister's standoff with Mr Cummings is a deliberate attempt by Number 10 to distract from the detail of the cronyism claims they face. A tactic known as a dead cat.
If you're going to play the dead cat strategy, it's very important to be certain the cat actually is dead. Now, this cat, the Cummings, appears to be very much still alive. And so we now have what is unquestionably a mortal combat.
And who do you think will win?
I don't want to call it. What I say is that Britain is the loser.
The Electoral Commission is currently seeking answers over the Downing Street refurbishment. A Number 10 spokesman said all donations were transparently declared in line with electoral law.